All right, hello again, Algebra 2 people. So we're going to start a new unit today. We're going to be talking about all the different parent functions kind of in general. And then a lot of these functions we're going to talk about in more detail as we get in through the year. So we'll spend different units on like quadratics and absolute value and stuff like that. But this is kind of an overview of what they all look like. Now, I will say this. So I'm going to split this into two videos. I'm going to do the first 5 of them today, and then I'll do the second 5 in a separate video just so the video isn't like super long and stuff like that. You are going to be responsible for knowing all these things and being able to, if you're given a graph, know what function that is. If you're given the name of the function, know what the domain and range is and the other properties and stuff like that. So you have to know everything about each of these things. So be sure that you're writing these down somewhere. This is a good template to use. Just kind of make a big table with the name, equation, graph, other properties, which we'll talk about, and the domain and range. We will talk more about domain and range after we go through all these functions and some different ways to write domain and range, but that'll be what we do early next week. Okay, so here we go. So the first function is really very boring, and we won't talk about this one very much. It's called the constant function, and the equation for that is just f of x equals c, where c is just any number. C is just a constant. It's just any kind of number. And the graph is just a horizontal line wherever c is. And of course, c can be positive, c can be negative, whatever. But whatever c is what is where that line is. By the way, as far as the graphs go, when we're in class, I will show you larger, kind of prettier graphs. But as long as you can identify a rough sketch of the graph and do a rough sketch on your own, that's going to be sufficient for us. Okay. This one doesn't have too many properties. Again, remember this is a horizontal line at C. Okay, and obviously whatever that C value is, that's going to be where the y-intercept is. Okay, the domain, obviously, if you remember from your algebra 1 days and even middle school days, the domain is our what the x values can be. So obviously that's everything, and we're going to write that as negative infinity to infinity. And the range, notice it never goes up and down except for that c value. So we're just going to write the range as just bracket c. Okay, again, not very interesting. We're going to move on. The next one is what you did a lot in algebra 1, which is the linear function. And of course, the function for that is just f of x equals x. It's also called the identity function. If you see it called the identity, don't freak out. It's the same thing. And again, the graph of that, and again, we're talking about just the parent function. We know there's all kinds of different forms because when you get into like mx plus b and stuff like that, there's all kinds of different ways the line can look. But the parent function is just that y equals x, which is that diagonal line through the origin. Okay. Now notice here the intercept, the x and y intercept are the same thing. It's intercept at the origin, which of course is 0, 0. So that's the x and y intercept both at the same time. And the other thing to note here is always increasing. Oops. Okay. And again, domain and range, domain, everything, range, everything goes up and down forever. So the domain and range are the same thing. This is going to be kind of a recurring theme, especially with the domain. Not so much with the range, but a lot of these things are going to have domain of negative infinity to infinity. Not all of them, but most of them will. Okay. And again, you did that mostly in algebra 1. We won't spend any time really on linear functions in here. But then what we're going to be doing from here on, these next few functions, you'll definitely see this year in more detail. So the next one, again, it's got a couple different names. We can call it the even function. Specifically, we're going to be looking at quadratics. Okay, and I'm going to kind of give you two different functions for this. The main one we're going to be concerned about in here this year is f of x equals x squared. But in general, you can also see it written as f of x equals x to the n power, where n is an even number, technically an even integer. So like if you see x to the fourth or x to the sixth or x to the eighth, they're all going to kind of follow the same general shape and same kind of general properties and stuff like that. The sketch of the graph, so this is what we call a parabola. The easy way to remember it's just a U shape. And again, it's going to be hitting right there at the origin. So again, the intercept at the origin. And notice this one is kind of going, it goes down and then up. So notice this point right here. And again, we're talking about the parent function, and we'll get in more detail on this. But for the parent function, this has a minimum value. And that minimum value is called the vertex. Okay. It also has something called an axis of symmetry. And you can, if you know what symmetry means, it kind of divides it in half. And again, and it's decreasing then increasing. There's different kind of things you can say with that. But those, I think, are the two main ones that you need to know for right now. Domain, again, x can be anything, goes on forever and ever. So negative infinity to infinity. But the range, notice it never gets below 0. So the way we're going to write the range is with a bracket. Super important. You see that it's a bracket to infinity, because it does go up forever and ever. Okay. Now, if we have an even function, I'll bet you can guess what the next one is, and that is an odd function. And specifically, we'll be talking a little bit about cubic functions, but it's kind of the same deal with this function that we get, that I said x squared or any even power. It's the same deal. So primarily, the main ones you're going to see are x to the third power, but you could see it as f of x equals x to the n, where n is an odd integer. So if you have like x to the fifth, x to the seventh, blah, 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 it's going to have the same basic properties. And this one looks something like this. So it's going to go up, it's going to kind of swing down a little bit, and then go down like this. Notice it's not a line, it's a smooth curve, and it goes up pretty quickly. But again, notice recurring theme goes to the origin again. So intercepted origin. And obviously it's going from low to high all the time, so it's always increasing again. There's also something we can say, and we'll get into this, it's more of a pre-calculus thing, but just kind of give you a preview. Even functions have very specific properties, and odd functions also have very specific properties. This actually does have some symmetry. It's a symmetric about this one point at the origin, which we can talk about a little bit later on in more detail. But all odd functions have one kind of property, and all even functions have some different properties. As far as domain, you can take a wild guess. Again, x can be anything, y can be anything because it goes up and down forever. So, as I said, another recurring theme: domain, all real numbers, range, all real numbers, negative infinity to infinity. And the last one we're doing today is going to be called the absolute value. And I think you've seen this a little bit in Algebra 1. And some people will abbreviate this as ABS. And if you want to abbreviate it ABS, that's fine. Or even ABV. I've seen that too. The function notation for this, it's two vertical bars. So it's something like this. Those vertical bars mean absolute value. And we'll talk more about that. We do have a unit later on this semester that talks specifically about absolute value functions and kind of how they're used and all that good stuff like that. But the graph of this, and it's super easy to remember, because remember absolute value, that first letter of the second word is V, the graph looks like a V. And it goes up forever on both ends. It's kind of like the parabola, only instead of a U, it's a V. But again, go figure, intercept at the origin. And it's got another minimum value here. It's got another vertex, so minimum value at 0, 0. This also has symmetry. So this also, if you look at the y-axis, kind of chops it in half, kind of the same kind of deal. And then the last one, of course, the domain. All of these things are the same. Domain of all of these are all real numbers. And then the range is very similar to our even function, because again, 0 to infinity includes 0. Again, please make sure you're using a bracket on the 0 and going from there. Okay. So those are the first 5 parent functions. I'm going to stop there for this video, and I'll do a second video for the other half of the functions. They will get a little bit more interesting, some different domains and some different ranges and some different looking graphs and stuff like that. So we'll do that on the next video. Again, please make sure and write these down. You got to know these things just by memory and be able to know kind of what they look like, the equations, all the good stuff like that. Until next time, stay safe.